Greetings everybody, and welcome to this impromptu review of the World Economic Forum's recently released Global Risk Report for 2021. Now, as most of you will surely know, roughly in January, February every year, the world's political and business leaders meet in Davos, Switzerland to discuss the big macro issues of the day. Now, it's at that forum that the Global Risk Report is presented and discussed. Now, the forum is not going ahead in January this year. It's been delayed to later in the year for obvious reasons, but I thought we could just have a quick run through the report and see what the key messages are. Before we get into this specific report, I want to have a look at some of the key messages of previous reports, because I think it's important we understand that this is not just another risk report. I realize there are many out there, but this is one that you really want to be paying attention to, because in previous years they've been pretty much on point. Now, for example, in 2019, the key message back then was sleepwalking into crisis. And the question that they basically asked the world was, are we sleepwalking into crisis because global divisions are materializing which are preventing us from working together on some of the world's largest macro threats? And they put a whole bunch of threats on the table, from climate change to increasing poverty to natural resource shortages to pandemics, which they said we weren't focusing on and we weren't collaborating on, and because of that we were exposing ourselves to them. Their particular concern was that there were a number of divisive political policies out there, from Trump politics to BREXIT to increasing trade wars, and all of these things were hardening divisions, and because of that we weren't collaborating on the risks that really mattered, and because of that we were potentially sleepwalking to crisis. Now, that was in January 21. Now, it was only roughly 11 months later, in November, December, in Wuhan, China, that we saw the emergence of the coronavirus. So that's pretty scary. The World Economic Forum told us that we were sleepwalking into crisis, and 10 months later, the first macro threat came along, which proved that point. Now, in 2020, when the 15th edition was presented at Davos, pandemic was just starting to take off. Coronavirus, we didn't truly understand it, but we knew something was there. So there were various hints about an emerging pandemic in this particular report, but of particular interest was some of the concerns around our failure to collaborate. And the theme there was about an unsettled world. And basically what they were saying was that we are now more divided than ever, and we're not collaborating on the threats that we need to collaborate on. And they asked various questions around who's leading the world and who's actually driving our ability to actually mitigate some of these threats. Obviously, the 2021 report is probably going to build on some of those. So I look forward to this with a little bit of anticipation. I really wanted to see what they were going to say about this year. So let's have a go and just review it and see what some of the key messages. So traditionally, this report always opens with an opening address. So this year it's from the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But for those of you who don't know, he is the chairman and also wrote the book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which looks at how our world is supposedly going to change due to various technology advancements over the next couple of decades. A book really worth reading if you're into technology disruption. So he starts off by saying that we warned you as early as 2006 that a pandemic was coming and we needed to start preparing for it. And the first chapter is a little bit of an I told you so, and he mentions numerous risk reports over the years that alluded to the fact that we should prepare for a pandemic. He then goes into some of the more detail around how we actually responded to the pandemic and how by 2020 the pandemic had materialized and completely disrupted the world. So the opening address, I think, is a little bit obvious, but I think the key message there is that there were numerous warnings that this was coming. Pandemics have been part of human history since the very beginning of time. There have been numerous dry runs and near misses over the years. So essentially what he was saying is that there was no excuse for being this unprepared for something that was both known and inevitable. If we then move through the report to the next section, this is where they start putting some of the graphs on the table. It's normally based around a global survey which they do every year, and basically they now lay out what the big ticket items are based on the perceptions of the people that they surveyed. And right at the top is infectious diseases and livelihood crisis, and a couple of interesting ones here which I'm going into a little bit more detail later. But if we just actually look at how they're spread over the likelihood and consequence diagram, which is the typical tool in risk management, I think the interesting thing I've found is that right at the top here, the two big ones are infectious diseases and climate change. Now, In 2019, I think infectious diseases was way down the middle. It was like number 10 in terms of impact, and I can't remember what its probability was, but it was in the middle of this cluster here. All of a sudden, it's raised to the front, which Klaus Schwab warns about. He says, you can't put the horse back in the barn after it's bolted. So, we probably need to be a little bit more forward-looking. But the fact that this is high up is because the perceptions are still very much rooted around how we're dealing with COVID-19. The other interesting one is climate change. That is still top of, and has been the last couple of years. But one of the big questions we ask is, well, what are we doing about it? And climate change hasn't gone away in the last year. We just haven't talked about it as much. And then there's a whole bunch of other risks which have stayed pretty much constant throughout the last couple of years. These are all macro risks. They're all interesting from the point that they can all escalate at any time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I want to move on because some of the key messages further in the report are probably more interesting to talk about. So if we scroll down, you'll see there's a couple of good visuals that actually show how these risks are actually laid out and are interconnected. That's worth looking at. But for the purpose of today, I want to look at some of the key reports that they've actually written in this document. So the rest of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report is just a series of papers written around particular risk themes, and I just want to touch on those because I think they're really interesting. The first one is the concept of a fractured future, and I think we all have to be aware of this. Leading up to 2020, the world was starting to divide naturally anyway. I mean, Trump politics, Brexit, trade wars, and various other things was all about dividing the country or dividing the planet up and not working together. Everybody looks after themselves. Then in 2020, COVID came along, and we just accelerated that line of thinking between the border lockdowns, the shutdowns, the enforced house arrests, social distancing. All of these policies were about dividing people and keeping them apart from each other. So for better part of a year now, we've been reinforcing this message that everybody must stay away from each other and we mustn't work together. And this has a potentially huge or catastrophic impact on future risk, because the only way we're going to deal with many of the macro risks that are out there is if we come together as a society and deal with it in a cohesive approach, which is essentially what they were saying in the 2019 risk report. They're just escalating it now. If we don't come together to deal on these risks, then many more of these risks are actually going to materialize. So I thought this was an interesting paper. If we move down and we look at the next paper, Error 404, Barriers to Digital Inclusivity. This is a great one. If you've read if you've read Klaus Schwab's Fourth Industrial Revolution book, you'll see that he has a particular concern at the rate at which technologies are accelerating and who's adopting and accepting these technologies. And it seems to be creating divisions, particularly between first world developed countries and third world undeveloped countries. Traditionally, developed countries are the first to adopt new technologies, but technologies are accelerating and emerging at such a rate that we now risk the undeveloped countries actually being left behind and creating massive social disruption, like increased poverty, increased unrest, and as such. So there's a lot of work to be done ensuring that digital access is actually inclusive. Moving down, the next paper, Pandemic, a Youth in an Age of Lost Opportunity. I thought this paper was fantastic, and it's one of the new themes that have come through, and I'd recommend you all to read it. Essentially, what we have now is a youth generation, typically your people in their late teens, their 20s and early 30s, who have lived through two global disruptors, the GFC of 2008, global financial crisis, and now the pandemic. And essentially what it said is that has actually disrupted the ability of many young people to advance naturally. They've been restricted one way or another, either economically or by a policy or just from the social distancing lockdown, and they're not being given the opportunity to proceed like they should be. There's particular concern that there won't be job opportunities out there that will allow them to get employed and get a start in life, either because the fourth industrial revolution is going to make many jobs obsolete, or because the COVID-19 impacts results in a delayed recession. So we now have this young generation coming through that potentially could become a lost generation if we don't ensure that they are provided with the same opportunities that perhaps some of us older people were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I thought that paper was really good and definitely worth reading. Moving down, The next paper was Middle Power Morass, Navigating Global Divides. And this tends to build on the fact that we're living in a more divisive world, but it looks more at global country level. And one of the key questions that I thought that came out of this paper, which I thought was really good, is who is currently leading the world? In the history, we've always had a dominant power to keep the world in check. So obviously, sort of up until the 80s, we had the two superpowers, US and Russia. But it's now clear that the East no longer follows Russian philosophy, and the West no longer sees the United States as their leader anymore. That was an interesting one. In recent years, the West has kind of either disassociated itself from the US, or the US has disassociated itself from all the other world problems. And as a result, nobody sees the US as their leader anymore. So now the question is, who's leading the world? Because if there's anything that we've learned from all those Godfather type mafia movies out there is that you need an all-powerful Don to keep everybody in check. Otherwise, all the middle bosses start fighting amongst themselves. And this is the concern here, is that we now have a world made up of middle powers who could start fighting and conflicting amongst themselves. So I thought this paper was very interesting. Moving down, have a look. Imperfect Markets, a disorderly industrial shakeout. And this basically talks about some of the disruption that COVID is going to have on industry, from changed working practices, all of a sudden working from home, video conferencing is going to become more important. Also, the fourth industrial revolution is going to change that. But it asks a lot of questions about what does the immediate future of industry look like? How is COVID going to impact it? And how are we going to re-energize the economy and re-enable working when it has been so severely disrupted over the last year? Moving down to the next paper, hindsight reflections on responses to COVID-19. So this paper looks at how many countries responded to COVID and puts a rear view mirror view of what we did. So 2020 hindsight and all that. But it's also a little bit critical and says, look, fact was we should have been better prepared. We should have had our systems in check. We knew this was coming and we did very little to prepare for it. So, a lot of the pain we're actually feeling right now is actually self-inflicted. But the question we've got to ask is, how are we going to come together to ensure that it doesn't happen again? And that's probably the big, powerful question there. So moving down to other sections. The last chapter I thought was really, really interesting. So this is a bit of a conceptual look at how some of the driving forces in the world right now could create new risks that we hadn't thought of. It's a bit of a out-the-box thinking, and it's called Foresight on Frontier Risk. So as an example, they lay out a whole bunch of things that could possibly happen. And one of the ones I really liked was this concept of an accidental war. So in the US right now, leading up to the inauguration of the latest president, we saw the Capitol being stormed based on generally fake news, untrue news, and biased news. So a lot of the news and messages that were being let out there weren't true, but it drove people to storm the Capitol. So if you take that idea of misinformation and take it to two warring factions or two warring countries, what happens if two countries actually go to war based on misinformation? That could actually happen. Tens of thousands of people could get killed or displaced based on fake news or untrue information. And this has been around for a while, and it's growing even more evident that people have the potential to react, fight, go to war based on news that they see in social media or any of the electronic platforms out there that is simply not true. And there's a whole lot of these scenarios that are raised out in this particular section, which I thought was interesting. And that's pretty much it. And then the appendix is just basically all the the contributors and the papers that were written that helped develop this particular document. And in terms of key messages learnt, I think there are a couple that we could probably talk about right now. I think the first one that was obvious is the world is hurting. The last year has been catastrophic to many people, and there are a lot of people really hurting at the moment, and we need to be empathetic by that and support them. That hurt could turn into disruption or violence. The world is fragmented. As I said, leading up to 2020, there were a number of policies out there dividing the world, but COVID-19 has just accelerated that. Everything from social distancing to lockdowns to shutting people in their homes and telling them not to come out for months has reinforced the message that we are, individuals who must look after ourselves, and we're fragmented. And unfortunately, we need to get people to start working cohesively to deal with all those other macro threats that are out there. So there's some work to be done in this area. There is a lack of a global senior leadership. So who is our guiding superpower right now? I don't have the answer to the question, but it's really interesting. In the absence of a clear leader, we start getting disruption and unhappiness amongst the middle leaders. The global risk landscape is no less threatening than before the emergence of COVID-19. All the other macro threats have not since disappeared. I really like that idea because, during the last year, the only risk people have been talking about is COVID. But climate change hasn't disappeared. Poverty hasn't disappeared. Natural resource shortages hasn't disappeared. We're just talking about it less. We're just focusing on it less. And that basically means that we now run the risk that one of those other ones will accelerate because we haven't been doing anything about it. There is severe work to be done to recover and re-enable our working world. Obviously, COVID has been incredibly disruptive and has isolated a lot of people. I need to get over that and recover from that if we are to progress and prosper in future years. There is a severe work to be done to improve our global society's resilience to future macro threats. So this has been a trending theme throughout a lot of my talks, as well as the World Economic Forum reports on this, that it's not enough to just recover from this crisis. We also have to build in our resilience to future crises and future macro threats. And it's something that I'm not convinced we've been paying a lot of attention to in recent months, but we are going to have to start paying attention if we don't want another macro threat to escalate like we saw in 2020. And I think that's pretty much it in terms of the key messages. I thought it was a really, really good report. I would encourage you to read it in detail, but it is quite wordy, so if you don't have time to read the report, just focus on the key messages. And like always, the big thing now we have to ask is, what are we going to do about this? We know it's out there, we know it's lingering. What are we going to do about it? So until the next session, thank you very much, and keep safe.